A slab of beef hits a scorching cast iron skillet, and the sizzle is almost violent. That sound alone used to mean something. It meant a man or a woman was standing over real heat, pressing real meat with real hands, making something from almost nothing. 4 ingredients: beef, bun, salt, maybe an onion. That was the American burger. And somewhere between that sizzle and the conveyor belt that replaced it, between the corner diner and the drive-thru lanes stretching around the block, something disappeared from American life so gradually that most people never noticed it was gone. This is not a story about nostalgia. This is a story about one of the most deliberate, profitable, and quietly devastating transformations in the history of human food, and it starts long before you were born. Go back to 1948. Pasadena, California. A small burger stand called McDonald's, run by 2 brothers, Dick and Mac McDonald, is doing something that had never quite been done before. They've stripped their entire operation down to almost nothing. Burgers, fries, shakes, a short menu, a clean kitchen, a flat-top grill, and the beef they were using was real. Locally sourced, ground fresh that morning, pressed into patties by hand. The bun came from a bakery a few streets away. The onions were chopped every single morning before the stand opened. Nobody called it farm to table because that phrase didn't exist yet. It was just food, simple, honest American food. And it tasted extraordinary, not because of some secret formula or engineered flavor compound, but because of something food scientists now spend billions of dollars trying to replicate in a laboratory. It was made from real things with care, close to where those real things came from. In post-war America, the burger wasn't just a meal, it was a cultural artifact. It meant something to bite into one. It meant prosperity. It meant the war was over, the factories were humming, the suburbs were being built, and a working man could bring his family to a diner booth and afford to eat well. The burger of the 1950s had a DNA that was almost childishly simple. Ground beef, usually 80% lean, 20% fat, because that fat ratio is what creates flavor, what makes the patty sing on a hot grill. A soft bun, slightly sweet, made with flour and yeast and water by a human being who knew what bread was supposed to feel like. A slice of American cheese, mustard, ketchup, pickles, raw white onion that would make your eyes water. That's it. Everything on that plate was something your great-grandmother could have grown, raised, or made herself. The supply chain was short. The relationship between the food and the person eating it was human, and the cook who made it, he probably knew the butcher, and the butcher probably knew the farmer. That was the world the American burger was born into. But here is the thing about success. It scales, and when something scales, it changes. Not all at once, not in ways you'd notice on a Tuesday afternoon, but slowly, systematically, driven by economics and logistics and the relentless structurally mandated pressure of profit, it changes completely. And the story of how the American burger changed is also the story of how America changed. How a nation that once gathered around a dinner table ended up eating alone in a car at 11 o'clock at night because the drive-thru is the only thing still open, and because sitting down to eat started to feel like a luxury nobody had time for anymore. Ray Kroc walked into that McDonald's in San Bernardino in 1954 and saw something that most people missed entirely. He didn't see a burger, he saw a system. A replicable, scalable, perfectly engineered machine that could theoretically be reproduced anywhere by anyone with minimal training and maximum consistency. He bought the rights. He started franchising. And within a decade, McDonald's was not a burger stand, it was an infrastructure. By 1970, there were over 1,500 McDonald's locations across the United States. By 1980, over 6,000. And every single one of them needed beef, the same beef, every single day, in every state, in every climate, in every city and suburb and highway exit from Maine to California. And that is where the story of the American burger begins to break apart at the seams. Because here is the brutal structural reality of industrial scale. You cannot source beef locally for 6,000 restaurants. You cannot have a butcher in every town. You cannot rely on a farmer 30 miles away when your nearest franchise is in the middle of rural Wyoming and your next one is in downtown Chicago. The geography alone makes it impossible. So the industry made a choice that felt logical at the time, a choice driven by practical necessity as much as by greed, and they industrialized the beef supply chain in a way that permanently altered what was inside the burger that America was eating. And what happened to that beef from the field to the freezer to the flat top is a story so extraordinary, so meticulously hidden from public view for so long that even now most people have no idea it happened. The cattle came first. In the 1960s, most ground beef in America still came from regional slaughterhouses and local butchers. The cattle were grass-fed or at minimum pasture-raised with grain finishing before slaughter. The process was slow and local and traceable in the way that food is supposed to be traceable, meaning you could, if you wanted to, follow the chain from the burger in your hand back to the animal it came from. By 1980, that chain had been severed. 4 companies controlled over 80% of America's entire beef processing capacity. Tyson, Cargill, JBS, National Beef. 4 companies feeding a nation of 200 million people. And when 4 companies control that much product, when the margin between profit and loss is measured in fractions of a cent per pound, efficiency stops being a preference and becomes a religion. Cattle were moved into what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, where thousands of animals live in confined quarters, standing on concrete or packed dirt, fed a diet of subsidized corn and soy. Corn and soy are not what cows evolved to eat. Their digestive systems were built for grass. When you feed a cow corn, their rumen, the first chamber of their 4-part stomach, becomes dramatically more acidic than it would be on a natural diet. That acidic environment is a perfect breeding ground for E. coli 157H7, one of the most dangerous foodborne pathogens in existence. A pathogen that before industrial feedlots was virtually unknown. It emerged essentially because we changed what cows ate, and changing their diet changed their gut chemistry, and changing their gut chemistry created conditions for a bacteria that can kill a child in 3 days. To combat that, the industry introduced routine antibiotics, not to treat sick animals, but to keep technically healthy animals alive in conditions that would otherwise kill them. Today, approximately 80% of all medically important antibiotics sold in the United States are used in livestock agriculture, not in hospitals, not in pharmacies, in feedlots. Those antibiotics travel through the food chain. They contribute to the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, what the CDC now calls one of the most urgent public health threats facing humanity. A threat that originated in significant part from a decision made in a boardroom in the 1970s about how to raise cattle more cheaply. And what nobody told you, what the industry spent extraordinary resources making sure you didn't ask about, is that all of this happened before the burger even got to the factory. Because the factory is where the story gets truly strange. By the late 1990s, the beef industry had developed a process for using the fatty trimmings that were previously considered too low grade to sell as ground beef. These trimmings, taken from the parts of the carcass with the highest contamination risk closest to the hide and the gut, were collected, exposed to ammonium hydroxide gas to kill the bacteria that naturally concentrated there, and then processed into a smooth, paste-like substance that could be mixed into regular ground beef without any labeling requirement. The beef industry called it lean, finely textured beef, a name so deliberately mundane that it functioned as camouflage. A USDA microbiologist who reviewed the process gave it a different name. She called it pink slime. And for nearly 20 years, it was quietly added to ground beef in fast food burgers, school lunch programs, and grocery store packages across America. No announcement, no label, no consent, just a cost reduction measure, implemented at scale, affecting hundreds of millions of meals. When investigative journalists finally broke the story in 2012, the public reaction was immediate and furious. Within weeks, several major chains removed it from their supply chains. But the more important question is not what happened after the story broke. The more important question is what nobody asked for 20 years while it was happening. What is in your burger right now that won't make headlines until 2035? A single modern fast food patty can contain beef from up to 100 different cattle, sourced from multiple countries, processed in facilities on opposite sides of the continent. One patty, 100 cows. That is not a burger. That is a statistical average shaped like a circle. And the beef is only the beginning. Because what happens to the flavor of beef when you industrialize it at that scale, when you strip out quality, when you replace slow-raised grass-fed cattle with commodity meat processed at industrial speed, is that you strip out the flavor along with everything else. Real beef, raised properly, has a taste profile built from the animal's diet, its muscle composition, the fat marbling that develops over time. It tastes like something, it tastes like itself. Industrial beef tastes like almost nothing. It is a protein delivery system with the flavor engineered out of it by the same process that engineered the cost down. So the industry turned to science. In science, with extraordinary creativity, with genuine brilliance, and with absolutely no concern for what it meant for the people eating the product delivered. There exists in industrial parks in New Jersey and Ohio and Illinois a parallel food industry that most people never think about. Companies with names like International Flavors and Fragrances, Givaudan, Symrise. Companies whose entire purpose is to make processed food taste like it is something it fundamentally is not. Their chemists are talented, genuinely talented, working at the intersection of neuroscience and organic chemistry to reverse engineer the flavor compounds that develop in real food through time and heat and biological complexity, and then synthesize those compounds from cheaper ingredients in a controlled environment. That smoky grilled quality in your fast food burger, it does not come from a grill. It comes from a compound called methylcyclopentenolone, synthesized in a laboratory and added to the product in precise concentrations calibrated to trigger a specific neurological response. That rich, beefy depth you taste, often it is autolyzed yeast extract, a savory, umami-forward compound derived from spent brewer's yeast that mimics the Maillard reaction flavor profile of well-cooked real beef without requiring the beef that produces it naturally. The bun, the soft, pillowy, slightly sweet bun that you almost certainly have never thought about for more than half a second in your entire life, is one of the most chemically complex foods in your entire meal. Calcium propionate to prevent mold growth during the distribution window that can stretch across weeks. Datum diacetyl tartaric acid esters of mono and diglycerides to improve dough stability during mechanical processing. Azotocarbonamide, a dough conditioner used in commercial bread production that until relatively recently was also used as a blowing agent in the production of yoga mats and shoe soles. The same chemical compound in your bun and in the foam padding under your feet at the gym. Your grandfather's bun had flour, water, yeast, salt, and a little sugar. 5 ingredients. Today's fast food bun averages between 15 and 20 ingredients. Some have more. The special sauce alone, that iconic layered condiment that defines the taste of a Big Mac, contains over 30 individual ingredients. Soybean oil, pickle relish containing yellow number 5, a synthetic dye derived from coal tar that is banned as a food additive in several European countries, calcium chloride, xanthan gum, propylene glycol alginate, sodium benzoate. Every single one of those ingredients is present for a reason that has nothing to do with making the sauce taste better to a human being, and everything to do with making it behave correctly during manufacturing, storage, and distribution at industrial scale. They are there for the product, not for you. And your grandfather's burger never contained a single one of them. The genius of this system, and it is a genius even if it is a troubling one, is consistency. The modern fast food burger's greatest achievement and its most revealing characteristic are the same thing. A Big Mac in Anchorage, Alaska tastes exactly like a Big Mac in Miami, Florida. Exactly the same salt level, the same sauce distribution, the same bun texture, the same patty diameter down to the millimeter. That consistency is not a natural property of food. Natural food varies. A tomato in July tastes radically different from a tomato in November. A grass-fed steer raised in Montana develops different flavors from one raised in Texas. Seasons matter, soil matters, geography matters, time matters. These variables are not inconveniences to be engineered out of the food system. They are the things that make food food, the biological and environmental complexity that produces genuine flavor and genuine nutrition. Consistency at industrial scale requires the elimination of those variables, and eliminating those variables requires an ingredient list that reads less like a recipe and more like a chemistry exam. It also requires a supply chain so enormous, so vertically integrated, so deeply embedded in government policy and agricultural subsidy that most Americans have been eating its output their entire lives without any meaningful understanding of how it works or who it benefits. Because this is where the story stops being about food and starts being about power. Between 1970 and 2000, fast food companies spent over $20 billion in lobbying efforts directed at federal regulators, Congress, and the USDA. The results of that investment were not subtle. Corn, the primary feed crop for industrial cattle, became the most heavily subsidized agricultural commodity in American history, receiving tens of billions in federal support annually. That subsidy made corn-fed industrial beef artificially cheap, which made fast food burgers artificially cheap, which made the traditional American diet of home-cooked meals from local ingredients structurally uncompetitive on price. The system was not designed to give Americans a choice between cheap processed food and affordable real food. It was designed to make processed food the default by making real food economically inaccessible to the people who could least afford to choose differently. School lunch programs were reformulated. Dietary guidelines issued by the USDA, the same federal agency responsible for promoting American agricultural products, were written in language that reflected industry lobbying more than independent nutritional science. A 1977 Senate report that recommended Americans eat less red meat was revised after intense industry pressure to instead recommend that Americans choose meats, poultry, and fish, which will reduce saturated fat intake, language that said the same thing in a way that didn't threaten beef sales. The burger on your tray was not just made in a factory. It was made possible by policy, and that policy was shaped by the same companies that made the burger. What this did to the American body is a crisis that is still unfolding in real time. The United States now spends over $190 billion annually treating obesity-related medical conditions. Heart disease, the #1 cause of death in America, is directly and causally linked to the ultra-processed dietary pattern that fast food normalized over 5 decades. Type 2 diabetes, which was essentially unknown as a mass public health problem before 1970, now affects over 37 million Americans. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, hypertension driven by chronic sodium overconsumption, conditions that were statistical footnotes in your grandfather's era, are now the defining health characteristics of a nation. And the foods at the center of all of these conditions share a common design philosophy: high palatability, engineered for repeat consumption, stripped of the nutritional complexity that makes food satiating, and loaded with the refined carbohydrates, industrial seed oils, and sodium that drive inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. The science behind why you cannot stop eating that burger is not a mystery. It is a design specification. Food scientists, many of them brilliant, most of them working under significant corporate pressure to produce results, have spent decades studying what they call the bliss point, the precise intersection of fat, salt, and sugar that triggers a dopamine response in the human brain, powerful enough to override satiety signals and drive continued consumption past the point of fullness. The mechanism is similar neurologically to the reward pathways activated by certain addictive substances. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is the finding of peer-reviewed neuroscience replicated in laboratory settings with brain imaging, published in journals that the executives who commissioned the research never expected anyone to read. They didn't change the taste of the burger, they changed your brain's relationship to taste. so that you would come back every day for decades. And you did. But the health crisis is only half of what the industrialized burger did to America. The other half is harder to measure and in some ways harder to recover from, because what fast food industrialized was not just a product, it was a behavior, a relationship with eating, a set of expectations about what food should cost, how long it should take to prepare, where it should be consumed, and what role it should play in a human life. The family dinner table, that imperfect, noisy, sometimes deeply inconvenient daily ritual that was, for most of American history, the primary site of family communication, cultural transmission, and social bonding, began disappearing in the 1970s. Not because families stopped wanting to eat together, but because the economic and social structures that had made that possible were being dismantled by the same forces building the drive-thru lane around the corner. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers in the 1970s, an enormously important and overdue social change, and the food industry was there to fill the gap, their departure from the kitchen, created not with better tools or shared domestic labor, but with processed convenience food that was cheap enough and fast enough to function as a replacement for home cooking. The fast food industry did not cause the breakdown of the American family dinner, but it profited from it, and it actively lobbied against the nutritional labeling requirements, the school lunch reforms, and the agricultural policy changes that might have made it easier for working families to eat real food without spending hours they didn't have preparing it. The diner closed, not all at once, not everywhere at once, but steadily over 20 years as the economics shifted irreversibly toward the chains. The corner diner was a community institution in a way that goes well beyond food. It was where people ran into each other, where the owner knew your name and your order and how your kids were doing in school, where the cook had a relationship with food that was personal and skilled and carried meaning. When the diner closes and a drive-thru opens in its place, something genuinely irreplaceable disappears from the social fabric of that community. And it happened in thousands of American towns, in the same decade, for the same economic reasons, so uniformly that it started to seem like an inevitable evolution rather than a specific, traceable consequence of specific policy choices made by specific people for specific financial reasons. Today, the American fast food burger sits at the intersection of all of these stories simultaneously. It is a product of industrial agriculture, flavor chemistry, nutritional science weaponized against the consumer, federal agricultural policy shaped by corporate lobbying, and 5 decades of deliberate behavioral conditioning. It costs less than $2 at the dollar menu. It contains 40-plus ingredients. It tastes almost exactly like it did 30 years ago because the flavor was engineered to be permanent, immune to the agricultural variability that once made food interesting in season and place specific. It is one of the most efficiently produced objects in the history of human civilization, and it is also, by almost any nutritional or ecological measure, one of the most costly. Something, though, is shifting. A counter-movement has been building slowly for 15 years, gaining speed now in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1995. A new generation of Americans, younger, more informed, more skeptical of institutional food systems than any previous generation, is pushing back. Craft burger restaurants using single-source, grass-fed, locally raised beef are growing in cities across the country. The regenerative agriculture movement, which argues that properly managed cattle grazing can actually sequester carbon and restore soil health, rather than degrading it, is attracting serious scientific attention and genuine investor interest. Consumers are reading labels and numbers that food companies find genuinely alarming, which is why so much money is now spent on packaging design intended to make 40-ingredient products look natural and simple. But here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all of this progress. For every craft burger restaurant that opens, 10 drive-thrus open beside it. The structural forces that made ultra-processed food dominant, the agricultural subsidies, the lobbying infrastructure, the supply chain investment, the $3 price point that no small producer using real ingredients can match, are still almost entirely intact. The system was built over 50 years. Dismantling it, if that is even the right word, will take time and political will and a public understanding of what was done and why that most Americans still do not have. Knowing the problem exists is the first step. Understanding how deep it goes is the second. Acting on that understanding in your kitchen, in your community, in your vote is the third. Your grandfather didn't read ingredient labels. He didn't need to. He didn't count macros or research agricultural subsidies or worry about what percentage of his beef came from CAFOs versus regenerative farms. He didn't need to, because the system he was eating from was by almost any measure more honest than the one we inherited. Not perfect, not without its own inequities and limitations, but honest in the most fundamental sense. The food was food, made from recognizable things, by recognizable people, close to where those things came from. Somewhere between the diner and the drive-thru, between the butcher and the factory, between 4 ingredients and 40, a different kind of change happened underneath the obvious one. It wasn't just that the burger got more complicated, it's that the relationship between Americans and their food became mediated by systems so large, so opaque, so economically entrenched that the individual eater effectively lost the ability to know what they were eating, where it came from, or what it was doing to them. That loss of knowledge was not accidental. It was, in many cases, the product of deliberate choices made by people who understood exactly what they were doing and calculated that the public would never look closely enough to notice. You are looking now, and the next time you unwrap that burger, don't feel guilty. Guilt is not useful here, and it was never the point. Feel curious instead. Ask what's in it. Ask why it costs what it costs. Ask why it tastes exactly the same in Seattle as it does in Atlanta, as it does in the town you grew up in. Ask who benefits from you not knowing the answer to any of those questions. Because the moment you start asking is the moment they lose control of what you decide, and you get to decide every single day, 3 times a day. That is more power than most people realize they have. Think about it.